Assalamu alaikum fam, hope you're doing fantastic. So, in this book, there's lots of wonderful lore, stories, history, and other things about ancient Rome. In this particular story, by Anthony Everett, who's a fantastic person who writes about ancient Rome, this is about the duel of the Curatii and the Horratii. So, let's begin. The third of the kings of Rome, Tullus Hostilius, was even more warlike than Romulus. So right off the bat, you begin to see that Roman leaders, they were really eager to have a strong military. And their men were masculine and soldierly. Wasn't, just being soft inside your villa eating grapes all day, right? They had their relaxed time, but war is something that they did focus on. His reign was marked by a long struggle with Alba Longa, the city from which Romulus and Remus had emerged to found Rome. So, Romulus and Remus, the twins who were suckled by a she-wolf, coming from the region Alba Longa, the city essentially, territory. This was, in effect, Rome's first civil war. So Rome's first civil war, conducted under the reign of Tullus Hostilius. The two sides made a treaty, according to which the loser of the conflict would agree to an unconditional surrender. I mean, yeah, if you lose, right? To avoid a full-scale battle with the attendant casualties, a duel was arranged between two sets of triplet brothers. So notice this. They're going to have three brothers on one side, three brothers on the other side, and they're going to fight it out. I mean, imagine Joe Biden fighting Putin. It would be quite hilarious. The Curatii for Alba and the Horratii for Rome. And then essentially it goes on to say that the Curatii were wounded and two of the Horratii were killed. So the survivor was Publius Horatius, and he ended up killing the Curatii. And it goes on. He had been able to tackle them one by one, where they became separated from each other because of their injuries. So he dealt with them individually, which is quite interesting, right? You can imagine this duel just going haywire. The hero of the hour, Publius, marched back to Rome carrying his spoils, the three dead men's armor. So here you see another example of armor being used to show that you have fully taken out your foe, right? It's really interesting how overcoming your enemies was essentially emphasized by the rulers themselves, right? Instead of saying your own country is bad, your people are bad, you should hate yourself, you should sit in victim blame. No, the leaders, literally led by example, faced death themselves, then marched triumphantly in front of the people to inspire them and to be the example. This is something that should be noted. At the city gates, he was greeted by his sister. It so happened that she was engaged to one of the Curatii. Well, that's awkward. She's like, "Where's my betrothed?" And then, her brother's got his armor. And when she noticed that Publius was carrying his bloodstained cloak, she let down her hair, burst into tears, and called out her lover's name. In a fit of rage, Publius drew his sword and stabbed his sister to the heart. "Take your girl's love and give it to your lover in hell," he shouted. "So perish all women who grieve for an enemy." Now this leaves lots to talk about. So, he essentially is showing how, if your own sister is grieving for the enemy, having this sort of punishment, right? You love this sort of, how would you put it? More of like a duty, it's the nationalism in a way. Even though they're not necessarily a nation yet, they're territorial in nature. But Rome was bigger than his sister, kind of reminds me how there's the story of Umar, may Allah be pleased with him, who, saw his sister reading parts of the Quran. He smacked her, well, did something, and, he was reluctant, and he was, changed his ways later. But that's sort of your sibling not getting in the way of, like, your personality, even though later he became a caliph. But there's something there of, like, there's not this soft, overwhelming, like, I have to let my female relatives walk all over me type of way, right? Even though it's not essentially the same, but what I'm trying to get at is this kind of manliness, or at least force, that isn't taken away or eroded because your relative is a female who is emotional or who is doing something. For example, let me see if I can get another better example. When the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said he would cut off Fatima's hand if she were one of those one who stole. There's like a hadith about that. And some people were like, what? You would punish your own daughter? And it's like, there's a sense of duty there, right? Sense of, when you feel like there's this something that has to be done for the good, that if your relative is being disobedient, then you have to do something about it. So Umar, when he came to his sister, he thought she was doing something wrong. Turns out she was just reading the Quran, but at the moment he didn't know that. So he thought he was doing something good, right? So he later saw the piece of the Quran and, became Muslim. But here, you see a different example, but the same underlying emphasis of there's something higher that goes above kinship, in a way. I hope I explained what I'm trying to get at. Because he got enraged here, right? He decided, hey, I'm going to take out, you for loving the enemy, your lover, more than your brother who's conquered the foes for the sake of Rome, right? It's an interesting example. It may sound cruel to us today because we live a more, Netflix life, but this is probably, I think, 2,000 years ago, so much different society, obviously. But there's something there of just like brute force. He went into a duel, came out alive, did that to his sister, and he's setting an example that no tears should be grieved for the enemy. So the enemy is the enemy, and that is that. And the enemy cannot soften the hearts of the women, right? To manipulate the male relatives to be kinder to the enemies. Something going on there. You can see this background here in like this almost like subliminal point that Publius is making by his actions, right? So Publius gets in trouble, and he has to create a memorial, and he has to kind of do an expiatory ceremony. It says here he had to carry a wooden beam that was slung across the roadway, and he had to walk on it with his head covered as a sign of submission. And there's this sort of, it says, a memorial built on where she died. And that Livy, the great historian of Rome, who wrote in the 1st century BC, writes, "The timber is still to be seen, replaced from time to time at the state's expense, and is known as the Sisters' Beam. The tomb of the murdered girl was built of hewn stone and stands on the spot where she was struck down." So if you remember when the Sabine tribe women were captured and the battles took place where the forum was, you'll notice that they built monuments on top of certain things. So the forum was built upon a battleground, and a battleground that was started from women being stolen. And this is a memorial for a woman who grieved too many tears for the enemy and her brother struck her down. So it's interesting how they seem to have built buildings on top of important locations. It's like, at least important locations in terms of history, even if the original meaning behind it is gone. They still decided to build upon that particular location, which is like, wow. And it says here by the author, for many of its citizens, the city of Rome was a stage where great and terrible deeds had been done. And so it just says that this sort of legendary, glorious past really emphasized the noble rage of valor. So here you see how Publius, drawing his sword to punish his sister for grieving for the enemy, is seen as a noble rage of valor. And noble rage of valor is something that they wanted their soldiers to have, and they're meant to have. So this is another example of what was a Roman man like during that time. And since this was the first civil war that Tullus Hostilius led, you begin to see how, wow, this is fantastic to learn about. Because ancient masculinity, is tracing those roots back to like the fashion style of Italy now, where the men wear tight pants and shiny shoes and cross their legs when they sit and make sure that their eyebrows are perfect and bathe themselves in perfume, cologne. You get to see how, the men have changed in Italy, It's just quite interesting. So, Tullus definitely appears to be more warlike than Romulus, and the Curatii and Horratii had a very interesting duel. So I wanted to share that with you, and hopefully you learned something. MashaAllah.